She was just a maid, or so he thought. But when Big Shaq discovers she's been sleeping in her car, hiding from a past too dangerous to name, he makes a choice that will change both their lives forever. Unraveling her secret means exposing a powerful enemy, one who doesn't forgive and never forgets. Now Shaq isn't just offering her help, he's putting himself in the line of fire. And the truth? It's more dangerous than either of them imagined. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal, or Big Shaq, as the world knew him, was a man larger than life, both in stature and in spirit. On the basketball court, he had dominated with sheer power, a force of nature impossible to stop. Off the court, in his second life as a businessman and philanthropist, he carried a different kind of strength, the kind that didn't seek applause. He helped people in silence, without cameras, without expecting anything in return. His mansion, a sprawling estate set in the heart of an affluent neighborhood, was everything one would expect from a man of his stature. But unlike the cold, lifeless luxury of many millionaires' homes, Shaq's was different. It was lived in, warm, and full of movement. The air carried the scent of fresh food from the kitchen, the sound of music filtering from the speakers, and the occasional laughter of house staff who knew they worked for a good man. Shaq had made it clear from the start. He didn't like people tiptoeing around him. He treated his employees well, paid them generously, and never forgot a birthday. He didn't believe in the hierarchy some rich folks imposed. To him, respect was mutual, and kindness didn't cost a thing. But amidst the bustling life of his home, one person always stood out. Or rather, blended in so well that she became almost invisible. Her name was Cassandra Wells, but to most, she was simply Cassie, the maid. Cassie was an enigma. She never spoke unless spoken to, never stayed to chat, and never made mistakes. She moved like a shadow, seamlessly transitioning from room to room, ensuring that every inch of the house remained spotless. She was efficient, meticulous, and, most noticeably, guarded. Shaq wasn't the type to pry, but something about Cassie bothered him. At first, it was little things. She never ate with the rest of the staff. The chef, an older woman named Diane, always prepared extra food, urging Cassie to take a plate, but Cassie politely refused every time. She also never seemed to bring lunch. Others would pull out homemade meals or take quick snack breaks, but Cassie? Nothing. Not even a granola bar. And then there was the fact that she was always the last to leave. Most of the housekeeping staff left at 6 sharp, clocking out and heading home to their families. Cassie, however, always lingered. Sometimes she'd find small tasks to do, dusting surfaces that were already clean, rearranging pillows that didn't need fixing. Shaq had noticed her leaving well past midnight on more than one occasion. He wasn't sure why, but something about that didn't sit right with him. One evening, after a long business call, Shaq stepped onto his balcony, inhaling the cool night air. The mansion's expansive driveway stretched below him, dimly lit by golden lamps. Most of the cars were gone, just his, and a few staff vehicles remained. That's when he noticed it. Cassie's car, a small, beat-up sedan, parked in the farthest corner of the lot. The paint was chipped, and the rear bumper had a crack running through it. She wasn't inside. Not yet. But she soon would be. Shaq leaned on the railing, waiting. A few minutes later, the mansion's side door opened, and Cassie stepped out. She carried herself the same way she always did. Head down, steps light, posture slightly tense like she was bracing against something unseen. She reached her car, unlocked it, and slid inside. The car didn't start. The headlights didn't flick on. Instead, she sat there. Minutes passed. Then more. Cassie didn't move. Shaq narrowed his eyes. What the hell was she doing? A thought crept into his mind, one he hadn't considered before. Was she waiting for someone? A boyfriend? A friend picking her up? But no one came. 10 minutes. 15. Still, she didn't move. And then, she did. Not in the way he expected, though. She shifted in her seat, then carefully, slowly, reclined the driver's side until it was almost flat. Then she curled onto her side, pulling a worn-out blanket over herself. Shaq's breath hitched. She was sleeping in her car. A weight settled in his chest, something heavy and unfamiliar. Shaq had seen homelessness up close before, on the streets, under bridges, in places people liked to pretend didn't exist. But this was different. This was a woman who worked every day, who was inside his house for hours, keeping it pristine. A woman who smiled politely when spoken to, who refused extra food, who made herself invisible, and yet she had nowhere to go at night. Shaq stepped back from the balcony, exhaling slowly. His mind raced with questions. Why? How had someone like Cassie ended up here? Why hadn't she said anything? Why hadn't anyone noticed? More importantly, what was he supposed to do about it? Shaq wasn't an impulsive man, but something inside him told him this wasn't something he could ignore. The next morning, he watched Cassie closely. She walked into the mansion as she always did, calm, composed, collected, as if she hadn't just spent the night sleeping in a freezing car. She greeted the staff, tied her apron, and got to work like nothing had happened. But Shaq saw it now. The subtle exhaustion behind her eyes, the stiffness in her movements, the way she rolled her shoulders as if trying to ease discomfort. She was used to it, used to the cold, used to the stiffness, used to pretending everything was fine. Shaq clenched his jaw. This wasn't just some temporary situation. She had been living like this for a long time, and no one knew. No one noticed. Except him. He wasn't sure what made him feel more frustrated. The fact that she was too proud to ask for help, or the fact that the world had made her feel like she couldn't. Shaq wasn't the type to force himself into people's lives. But this was different. He wasn't going to let this slide. Cassie may not have asked for help, but that didn't mean he wouldn't give it. Shaq had always been an observant man. It was a skill honed from years of reading defenses, anticipating plays, and sensing what was coming before it happened. On the court, it had made him a legend. Off the court, it had made him a man who could see through people, see past what they wanted the world to believe. And right now, what he saw didn't sit right with him. It was past midnight, and Shaq was standing on his second-floor balcony, looking down at the driveway. The estate was quiet, most of the staff long gone, their cars no longer lining the parking lot. But one car remained, Cassie's. A small, battered sedan that looked like it belonged to a different world than the polished luxury surrounding it. She should have been gone by now, but she wasn't. Shaq leaned against the railing, his massive arms folded, watching. The car wasn't running. The headlights weren't on. She wasn't leaving. For a long moment, nothing happened. The stillness stretched, heavy and strange. Then, movement. Cassie shifted in her seat, reaching for something in the back. A moment later, she disappeared from view. Shaq frowned. Another few seconds passed, and then it became clear what had just happened. She wasn't just sitting in her car. She was laying down. Shaq felt his stomach tighten. Why? The thought repeated itself, looping in his mind. Why wasn't she leaving? Why was she staying here when she could go home, relax, sleep in a bed? Unless she didn't have one. Shaq exhaled slowly, a sense of unease creeping up his spine. It didn't make sense. Cassie was one of the most dependable workers on his staff. She had been here for months, showing up every day, never once calling out, never once complaining. If she was struggling, if she was homeless, how had no one noticed? More importantly, why hadn't she told anyone? He stood there, unmoving for another 10 minutes, watching. She never sat up, never adjusted, just lay there, still as the night itself. Shaq wasn't sure how long he stayed, but eventually he turned and walked back inside. He didn't have enough information. Not yet. He needed to know more, and he was going to find out. The next morning, Shaq watched Cassie closely. She arrived at work exactly on time, just like she always did. Same uniform, same quiet presence. She carried herself with the same efficiency, moving through the house like a shadow. But now, Shaq saw the details he had missed before. The tightness in her shoulders, the way she rolled her neck slightly, as if shaking off stiffness, the way she shifted her weight from foot to foot. Small things that made perfect sense now that he knew. Sleeping in a car wasn't the same as sleeping in a bed. He should have seen it earlier. She worked through the morning with quiet precision, her hands moving swiftly, eyes never meeting anyone's for too long. A few times, one of the other housekeepers tried to chat with her, but she kept her answers short, polite, never lingering in conversation. Shaq was patient. He let the day play out, watching, waiting. By the time evening rolled around, most of the staff were heading out, their voices filling the halls as they said their goodbyes. Cassie didn't join them. Instead, she stayed behind, moving through the kitchen, wiping down counters that were already clean. Shaq knew what she was doing. She was stalling. His gut told him this wasn't something new. This was a pattern, a routine she had perfected. Wait until everyone was gone. Leave when no one was around to see. Park in the furthest corner where no one would notice. But he noticed. And tonight, he wasn't letting it slide. Shaq didn't follow her immediately. He let her go through the motions. Let her leave the house, head to her car, slip inside, and close the door behind her. Then, he waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Her car never moved. Shaq stepped outside, walking slowly, making sure his footsteps didn't carry too loudly against the pavement. His shadow stretched long under the dim glow of the driveway lights. Cassie's car sat in the same place, dark and unmoving. He approached from the side, careful, not wanting to startle her. When he got close enough, he could see through the windshield. Cassie was curled up in the driver's seat, eyes closed, arms folded against her chest like she was bracing against the cold. A thin blanket was pulled up to her shoulders. Shaq stared, his chest tightening. She wasn't waiting for anyone. She wasn't about to leave. She had nowhere else to go. A cold realization settled over him, heavier than he expected. This wasn't just one bad night. This was her life. And for the first time in a long time, Shaq felt something he hadn't felt since his childhood, helpless. Not because he couldn't do something about this. He could. But because Cassie wouldn't let him. He could see it in the way she carried herself, in the way she moved through the world. She didn't ask for help. She avoided attention, avoided pity. She kept her struggles to herself because somewhere along the way, the world had taught her that no one was coming to save her. And maybe, until now, that had been true. But it wasn't true anymore. Shaq exhaled, stepping back from the car, his mind already working. He had to be careful. If he approached this the wrong way, she'd shut him out completely. He couldn't let that happen. Because whether she knew it or not, Cassie wasn't alone anymore. And he wasn't about to let her keep living like this. Shaq wasn't a man who ignored his gut. His instincts had carried him through life, from the court to the business world, and now they were screaming at him. Something was wrong. Cassie was hiding something. He had seen it in her eyes the night before when she lay curled up in the front seat of her car, using a thin blanket as her only protection against the cold. He had seen it again this morning, in the stiffness of her movements, the way she rolled her shoulders like she was shaking off discomfort, the quiet exhaustion lining her face. But she wasn't going to tell him. That much was obvious. So he was going to find out himself. And for that, he needed a plan. That evening, just before the staff started wrapping up for the day, Shaq waited near the kitchen, acting casual. The room was buzzing with conversation as housekeepers gathered their things, talking about their plans for the night. Some were heading home to their families. Others were meeting up with friends. Cassie, however, was silent. She stood at the sink, rinsing out a cloth, her back straight, her focus locked on the task at hand. No distractions, no unnecessary chatter, like always. Shaq cleared his throat. "Hey, Cassie." She turned, eyebrows slightly raised. "Yes? I'm heading out. You need a ride home?" It was a simple offer, just a few words. But Shaq was watching closely, and there it was. The flicker of hesitation in her eyes, the slight shift in her stance, the way her fingers curled just a little too tightly around the dish towel in her hands. "No, thank you," she said, voice steady, but too quick. Shaq nodded slowly. "You sure?" "It's late. I have my car." She was already untying her apron, moving with quiet urgency. "I appreciate it, but I'm good." Shaq didn't push. He just gave her a slow, easy nod and let it go. "All right, be safe." Cassie gave him a tight-lipped smile and slipped through the back entrance faster than usual. Shaq exhaled, glancing at the time. Now it was time to see where she really went. He gave her a 5-minute head start before following. His car was unmissable, a blacked-out SUV that screamed wealth, but he knew how to keep his distance. He drove slow, hanging back as Cassie's old sedan made its way through the quiet streets. She wasn't going toward a residential area. She wasn't even heading toward the outskirts of town. Instead, she pulled into a gas station. Shaq frowned. It wasn't a stop on the way somewhere. It was the kind of place people only went to if they needed fuel, snacks, or a restroom break. Cassie didn't get out. She just sat there, waiting. For what? Shaq parked across the street, watching. 10 minutes passed, then 15. She wasn't calling anyone. She wasn't looking around like she was meeting someone. She was just sitting there. A slow realization crept over Shaq. She wasn't waiting for someone. She was waiting for time to pass, like she was stalling, like she didn't have anywhere to go. His jaw tightened. He stayed put, watching as she eventually started the car again and pulled out of the gas. Station point. This time, he followed closer. She drove to the other side of town, far from the polished neighborhoods, past the places where people lived comfortably, until she reached an old, near-empty parking lot behind a strip of abandoned buildings. Shaq already knew what was about to happen. Still, when Cassie parked, turned off her engine, and shifted in her seat to grab her blanket, it hit him hard. She wasn't just spending the night here. This was her home. The realization sat like a weight in his chest. She didn't have an apartment. She didn't have a house. She had this car. This battered, barely running car with its cracked bumper and faded paint. A car that wasn't meant to be lived in. A car that couldn't possibly keep her safe. Shaq swallowed, his fingers gripping the steering wheel. He had spent his life working hard so he'd never have to struggle again. He had made sure his kids never had to go through what he had growing up. But Cassie? Cassie was struggling, and no one knew. Not the other staff. Not her coworkers. She had been hiding it. Why? Why hadn't she asked for help? Why was she doing this to herself? Was it pride? Fear? A mix of both? Shaq exhaled, his mind racing. He couldn't just walk up to her now. She would be embarrassed, angry. She'd shut him out completely. If he was going to help her, he needed to do it right. For now, he backed away, pulling out of the lot, leaving her be. But one thing was certain. He wasn't letting this go. Shaq wasn't the type to let things slide. Now that he knew the truth, he couldn't just sit back and pretend like nothing was wrong. Cassie had been working in his house for months, walking these halls, keeping everything spotless. And yet, she had nothing. No home, no bed, just a car and a secret she thought no one had figured out. She was too proud to ask for help. That much was clear. So, Shaq had to be smart about this. If he came at her directly, she'd shut down. She'd make excuses, push him away, maybe even quit just to avoid the conversation. He couldn't let that happen. He had to play this carefully. He had to test her. The next day, Shaq waited until the late afternoon, when the house was quieter. Most of the staff were still around, finishing up tasks, but the dinner rush hadn't started yet. Cassie was moving between rooms, her usual silent, focused self. Shaq watched as she adjusted a decorative vase in the hallway, making sure it was perfectly centered. She was always precise, always in control. Time to shake that control. "Man, I swear," Shaq said casually, leaning against the doorway. "I was just looking at this new apartment downtown. Top floor, full skyline view. Crazy expensive, but I guess some people like wasting money." He wasn't even looking at her, not directly, but he didn't have to. He felt her reaction, a moment of stillness. Not long, not obvious. Just a fraction of a second, where she stopped adjusting the vase, her fingers hovering over the edge. Then, just as quickly, she recovered. "That sounds nice," she said lightly, moving to dust a shelf that didn't need dusting. "Must be a great view." Shaq hid his smirk. She was deflecting. He mused. "You ever lived in a place like that? Big windows, lots of space?" Another beat of silence. This one just a little longer. Then, there it was. The panic. Not full-blown, not obvious to most people, but Shaq caught it. The slight tightening of her shoulders, the way her hand gripped the cloth just a little too hard. She cleared her throat. I've never been much for luxury. Shaq's stomach twisted. She wasn't just dodging the question. She was running from it. That meant one thing. She had lost something. And whatever it wasn't just money. Now Shaq watched her closer. Not just the way she spoke, but the details, the things that most people overlooked. Her uniform was always clean, always neatly pressed. But up close, the fabric was beginning to fray. The seams on her sleeves were worn. The cuffs were slightly discolored, like they had been washed too many times without proper detergent. Her shoes were polished, but the soles were thinning. And her hands, rough. Not just from cleaning, from something worse. Shaq had seen hands like that before. Hands that spent too many nights gripping a steering wheel instead of a pillow. Hands that curled into fists in the cold because there was no heater to keep them warm. Cassie wasn't just living in her car. She was surviving in it. And it was taking a toll. Shaq felt something deep in his chest, something heavy, something angry. Not at her. At the world that had let her fall this far, and maybe a little at himself. Because she had been here this whole time. And he hadn't seen it. That night the rain came down hard. Shaq stood near his front window, watching as the storm rolled through. Heavy sheets of water slammed against the pavement, filling the night with a steady roar. Most of the staff had already left. Except Cassie. She was still here, finishing up in the kitchen, putting things back in order long after the others had gone. Shaq checked his watch. Past 11. She was stalling again, waiting for the house to be empty, waiting for her routine to stay unnoticed. But tonight was different. Tonight she wouldn't be stepping into a cool, crisp evening. Tonight, she was about to walk straight into a storm. Shaq exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. He could already picture it. Cassie, running through the rain, fumbling with her keys, curling into the front seat of her car, shivering under that thin, useless blanket. Something in him snapped. He couldn't do this anymore. Enough games. Enough waiting. Tonight, he was stopping her. The kitchen door opened, and Cassie stepped outside. Shaq followed. The rain was coming down hard, instantly soaking through her clothes. She flinched at the cold but kept moving, arms wrapped around herself as she hurried toward her car. She fumbled with her keys, trying to unlock the door. Her hands were shaking, her movements too clumsy, too desperate. Shaq took a step forward. Cassie. She froze. Not because of the rain, but because of him. Slowly she turned, her hair already dripping, her uniform clinging to her frame from the downpour. Shaq? She asked, blinking water from her eyes. What are you doing out here? Shaq didn't answer. He just stared at her. She looked so small. For the first time, he wasn't seeing Cassie, the maid. He was seeing Cassie, the woman who had been fighting like hell to survive, and she was losing. You can't stay out here, he said, his voice low, steady. Cassie shook her head quickly, taking a step back. I'm fine. No, you're not. She tried to smile. I'll be okay. Shaq's jaw tightened. Cassie, stop. The smile faltered. For the first time, she looked exposed, vulnerable, like someone who wasn't used to being seen. Shaq took another step closer. You don't have to do this. Her breath hitched. For a second, just a second, she looked like she might let go, like she might finally break. But then she shook her head. I can't. She turned back toward her car, trying to escape. Shaq acted fast, not grabbing her, not blocking her way, but stepping between her and the car. She stopped, eyes wide. Move, she said, but there was no heat in it, no real fight. Shaq just shook his head. Not until you tell me why. Her hands clenched. Her whole body was trembling now, not just from the rain, but from something deeper. I don't need your help, she whispered. Shaq looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. Then why are you crying? Cassie stiffened. She hadn't even noticed. The rain was washing away the tears before they could fall properly. But they were there. And she knew it now. Shaq exhaled. Cassie, I get it. I do. But you don't have to keep running. You don't have to do this alone. Her lip trembled. For a long time, she just stood there, staring at him, the rain soaking both of them to the bone. Then finally, she looked away, not in defiance, in defeat. Shaq had won, but not in the way he wanted to. Shaq had waited long enough. For days, he had watched Cassie pretend. Pretend she was fine. Pretend she had somewhere to go. Pretend she wasn't out there every night, sleeping in her car, fighting a battle no one could see. But last night, standing in the pouring rain, shivering, exhausted, she had cracked. Not fully. Not enough to let him in, but enough for him to see the truth. And now he wasn't giving her a choice. Shaq stood by the window watching. The rain had stopped, but the cold lingered in the early morning air. Cassie had stayed overnight, not inside the house but in the car. Again. Shaq clenched his jaw. This was it. Enough. He turned, heading outside, his footsteps heavy against the pavement. As he reached her car, she was just waking up, rubbing her arms for warmth. She looked up and froze. Shaq was standing at her door, his massive frame casting a shadow over the small car. His face was unreadable, but his stance said everything. She swallowed. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel like she might drive away. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. Get in the house. His voice wasn't angry, just firm. Cassie's breath hitched. She shook her head quickly, her voice quiet but determined. I don't need help. A heavy silence stretched between them, then Shaq's jaw ticked. I ain't askin'. The words hit her like a force. She looked away, blinking fast, her chest rising and falling. Shaq exhaled, softened. Cassie. His voice was quieter now. Come inside. She shook her head again, harder this time. I can't. Why? Cassie squeezed her eyes shut. Her whole body was trembling, not from cold this time. I just can't. Shaq crouched slightly, leveling himself with her, giving her nowhere to run. Why? He asked again, gentler now. Cassie pressed her lips together. And then, she broke. Tears spilled before she could stop them. I lost everything, Shaq. Her voice was barely a whisper. Everything. Shaq stayed silent, letting her speak. Cassie wiped her face, but the tears wouldn't stop now. I had an apartment, a good one. I had a life, a decent job. And then... She swallowed hard, shaking her head. Then it all fell apart. Shaq leaned against the car, waiting. Cassie exhaled shakily. I had savings. Not much, but enough. Then my job cut my hours. Rent went up, bills piled up. It happened so fast. Shaq's stomach twisted. He had heard stories like this before. I tried everything, she continued. I begged my landlord for an extension. He didn't care. I tried staying with friends, but no one had room. I had nowhere to go. Her hands trembled. And then one day I came home and everything was gone. My stuff was on the street. My key didn't work. Just like that, I wasn't a tenant anymore. I was nobody. Shaq gritted his teeth, anger simmering beneath his skin. I slept at shelters for a while, Cassie said, voice hollow. But they're not safe. I thought, maybe I could get a second job, save up, get back on my feet. Her lips twisted into a sad smile. You ever tried getting a job when you don't have an address? Shaq exhaled sharply. People don't want to hire the homeless, she whispered. They don't trust you. They assume the worst. She laughed bitterly. So, I did what I had to do. I kept my head down. I worked. And I kept my secret. Shaq's throat tightened. Cassie turned to him, eyes filled with something raw. And I've been okay, Shaq. I've survived. I don't need a handout. I don't need saving. Shaq stared at her for a long moment. Then, his voice dropped, steady and unshakable. You're not okay, Cassie. Her breath hitched. You are not okay, Shaq repeated. And surviving? That ain't the same as living. Cassie swallowed hard, looking away. Shaq signed. You don't trust anyone, do you? Cassie hesitated. I trust myself. Shaq let those words settle. Then, he nodded. Good, he said. Then trust yourself to know when you need help. Cassie's lip trembled. Shaq stepped back, nodding toward the house. Come inside. Cassie wiped at her face. But this time, she didn't argue. She nodded and followed him in. Shaq had heard a lot of stories in his life. Stories of struggle, of triumph, of people fighting against impossible odds. Cassie's story? It didn't sit right. Not because she was lying. No, the pain in her voice last night was real. The way she broke down, the way her hands trembled as she spoke about losing everything, that was real. But there was something missing. Something she wasn't telling him. Shaq had spent too many years around too many people to ignore that gut feeling. And right now, his gut was screaming at him. The next morning, Shaq walked into his office, closing the door behind him. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. Anthony Reynolds, his personal lawyer. If anyone could dig up the truth, it was him. The phone rang twice before a crisp voice answered. Shaq, to what do I owe the pleasure? Shaq leaned back in his chair. I need a favor. There was a pause. You don't usually call for favors. Shaq exhaled. Yeah, well, this one's different. Reynolds didn't ask questions. He never did. He just listened as Shaq explained the situation, keeping it vague, keeping Cassie's name out of it for now. I need a background check, Shaq finished. Nothing crazy, just basic information. Reynolds hummed on the other end. Shouldn't be too hard. What's the name? Shaq hesitated. Then, he said it. Cassandra Wells. Reynolds typed something in the background. Got it. Give me a few hours. Shaq nodded. Appreciate it. He hung up. Now, he waited. A few hours turned into half the day. Shaq busied himself with meetings, emails, anything to keep himself distracted. But when his phone rang again and Reynolds' name flashed across the screen, he knew. Something wasn't right. He answered on the first ring. Yeah? There was a pause, longer than usual. Then Reynolds spoke. Shaq, we have a problem. Shaq sat up straight. What kind of problem? Reynolds exhaled. Cassandra Wells doesn't exist. Shaq's blood ran cold. What? Reynolds' voice was steady, but there was a sharpness to it. There's no record of her. No birth certificate, no driver's license, no credit history, nothing. Shaq felt his heartbeat pick up. That's not possible, he said. She works for me. I'm telling you, Shaq, legally she doesn't exist. Shaq's fingers curled into a fist. Then who the hell is she? Reynolds was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that sent a chill down Shaq's spine. She changed her identity. Silence. Heavy. Thick. Shaq's jaw tightened. Why? I don't know, Reynolds admitted. But people don't erase themselves unless they have a damn good reason. Shaq's grip on the phone tightened. Cassie wasn't just homeless. She was hiding. From what? From who? And most importantly, why hadn't she told him? Shaq barely noticed the rest of the day. His mind was too busy racing. He kept replaying the conversation in his head, every word twisting like a knot in his stomach. Cassie had built an entire life on silence. She didn't talk about her past. She avoided questions. She had no personal belongings, no traceable connections. Because she had erased herself. The question was why. Shaq wasn't stupid. People ran for reasons. Some ran from debt. Some ran from mistakes. Some ran from people. The thought made his chest tighten. Was she in danger? Was she protecting herself? Did she even trust him enough to tell the truth? He had to find out. Now, that night, Shaq waited until the house was quiet. Cassie was still awake, working late as usual, cleaning up even though he had told her 1,000 times she didn't need to. He found her in the dining room, wiping down the already spotless table. She didn't hear him at first, not until he said her name. Cassie. She froze. Slowly, she looked up. Her eyes searched his face, sensing something was off. Shaq crossed his arms. We need to talk. Cassie set the cloth down carefully. Okay. Shaq exhaled. Who are you? She blinked. What? Shaq took a step forward. Who are you really? Her whole body locked up. I don't know what you mean, she said carefully. Shaq shook his head. Yeah, you do. Cassie swallowed. Shaq, I ran a background check. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't soften the words. Cassie's face went pale. Shaq saw the panic in her eyes before she masked it. Saw the way she tensed, the way her fingers curled into fists. She wasn't just surprised, she was terrified. There's no record of you, Shaq continued. No past. No history. No nothing. Cassie's breathing hitched. You changed your identity. His voice was quieter now. Didn't you? A long, painful silence. Cassie's lips parted, but no words came out. Shaq stepped closer. Cassie, what are you running from? Her chest rose and fell, her breaths shaky, uneven. I can't. Shaq's stomach twisted. You can't or you won't. Cassie pressed a hand to her forehead, exhaling sharply. I shouldn't have stayed this long, she muttered. Shaq's heart dropped. You were gonna leave. It wasn't a question. Cassie hesitated. Then quietly, I have to. Shaq clenched his jaw. The hell you do? She looked up, eyes glassy. Shaq, you don't get it. It's not safe. Safe from what? Cassie's hands trembled. From who? Something cold ran through Shaq's veins. This wasn't about pride. This wasn't about stubbornness. This was fear. Real. Raw. Bone-deep fear. Shaq stepped forward, lowering his voice. Cassie, whatever it is, whatever happened, you don't have to do this alone. Cassie let out a shaky breath. You don't understand. Then make me understand. Her jaw tightened. I can't. Shaq exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. Cassie, listen to me. If you leave now, where do you go? Back to your car? Back to hiding? Her silence was the only answer he needed. You can't live like this forever, he said, quieter now. Cassie looked away. Shaq softened. Stay, he said. At least until we figure this out. Cassie hesitated. She wanted to say no. He could see it in her eyes. But deep down, she knew he was right. And so, after a long, agonizing pause, she nodded. Shaq exhaled, relief hitting him hard. But in the back of his mind, one thought still lingered. If Cassie was hiding from someone, whoever they were, would they eventually come looking? Shaq had faced a lot of tough situations in his life. He had played against the best, taken on challenges most people couldn't imagine, and built a life that people only dreamed of. But right now, sitting across from Cassie in his dimly lit study, he knew. This was different. This wasn't a game. This wasn't business. This was a woman's life. And it was time for her to tell the truth. Cassie sat stiffly in the chair, her fingers gripping the armrests like they were the only things keeping her grounded. Her usually calm face was drawn tight, eyes darting toward the door as if she was debating whether to run. Shaq leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. His voice was steady but firm. I know you're lying about who you are. Cassie's body went rigid. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. Shaq watched her closely. There's no record of you, no past, no real identity. I ran a check, Cassie. Her breathing hitched. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then, her hands started shaking. Shaq exhaled. I need you to tell me the truth. Cassie licked her lips, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Then, finally, she whispered, I was framed. Shaq's stomach clenched. Cassie swallowed hard. I lost everything, Shaq. Not because I made bad choices, not because I messed up, but because someone powerful, wanted to make sure I disappeared. Shaq's jaw tightened. Who? Cassie let out a shaky breath, staring at the floor like she was reliving something she had spent years trying to forget. His name is Daniel Mercer. Shaq frowned. The name wasn't familiar. He owns a financial empire, Cassie continued. Real estate, investments, political connections. He's untouchable. Shaq narrowed his eyes. And you? Cassie gave a bitter laugh. I used to work for him. Shaq felt a cold wave settle over him. What happened? Cassie finally looked up, eyes filled with something dark. They needed a fall guy. Cassie inhaled deeply, her fingers digging into the fabric of her jeans. I was an accountant. Nothing big. Just another employee working in one of his dozens of companies. I had no power, no say in anything. I was just doing my job. Shaq stayed silent, letting her talk. One day, I noticed some numbers didn't add up. A few accounts had weird discrepancies, missing funds, transfers that didn't make sense. At first, I thought it was an error, so I flagged it, sent a report. Her lips curled into a humorless smile. That was my first mistake. Shaq's chest tightened. I got called into a meeting, Cassie continued, her voice hollow. They told me it was an internal audit, nothing to worry about, just routine. Her hands clenched into fists. But it wasn't a meeting, Shaq. It was a setup. Shaq felt the air shift. The weight of her words pressed down. They pinned it all on me, Cassie whispered. The missing money, the fraud, the illegal transfers, it was all dumped into my name. I was nothing to them. Just a disposable employee. Shaq exhaled sharply. You went to trial? Cassie shook her head. It never got that far. Shaq frowned. Cassie swallowed hard. They told me if I went to the cops, I'd regret it. That my life would be over before I even had a chance to defend myself. A shiver ran down her spine. And then, just like that, my bank accounts were frozen. My apartment lease was terminated. My name was put on a watch list. I was blacklisted from every major firm. I couldn't get a job. I couldn't get an apartment. I was erased. Shaq's jaw locked. His hands curled into fists. This wasn't just a bad situation. This was deliberate. Why didn't you fight it? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Cassie let out a bitter laugh. Fight Mercer. The man owned senators, judges, entire law enforcement departments. What was I supposed to do? Shaq felt a deep, simmering rage settle in his chest. She had been silenced. She had been hunted. And worst of all, she had been alone. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Shaq leaned back, exhaling. And now? Cassie looked at him. Shaq's eyes were sharp, his voice low. Is he still looking for you? Cassie hesitated. Then slowly she nodded. Shaq clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about helping her get back on her feet. This was about keeping her alive. Cassie let out a shaky breath. I should leave. Shaq's head snapped up. Cassie was already standing. I should go before this gets worse. Shaq stood too, towering over her. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Cassie flinched. Shaq, you think running is gonna solve this? His voice was sharp, frustrated. You've been running for years, Cassie. Has it helped? Cassie looked away. Shaq took a step closer. Listen to me. You are not alone in this anymore. Her eyes snapped back to his. Shaq's voice was low, firm. You have me now. Cassie swallowed hard. I don't care who Mercer is, Shaq continued. He's not untouchable, and he sure as hell ain't getting his hands on you. Cassie's breath hitched. You don't understand. Shaq's eyes burned. Then make me understand. Cassie exhaled shakily, her fingers trembling. If I stay, if he finds out, he won't just come after me, Shaq. She swallowed. He'll come after you. Shaq stared at her. Then, he let out a slow, deliberate breath. And he smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not a soft one. But one that said, let him try. Cassie shuddered. Because for the first time in a long time, she believed him. Shaq had spent his life making decisions under pressure. With seconds left on the clock, with the weight of a game on his shoulders, with thousands of fans watching his every move, he had learned to trust his instincts. But this was different. This wasn't about winning. This was about saving a life. And right now, he had two choices. Walk away. Pretend like none of this was his problem. Let Cassie disappear into the world again. Let her keep running, keep hiding. Or risk everything to help her. To take on a man with power, connections, and a reach far beyond anything Cassie could fight alone. Shaq didn't hesitate. There was only one real choice, and it was hers. Shaq sat in his office, phone in hand, staring at the number on the screen. It had been a long time since he had called in favors like this. A long time since he had needed to. But this wasn't business. This was bigger. He pressed dial. After 2 rings, a voice answered. Shaq? Derek, Shaq said. I need you to look into someone. There was a pause. This about basketball? Shaq exhaled. No. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, what's the name? Shaq's jaw tightened. Daniel Mercer. Derek cursed under his breath. Mercer's a shark, man. You sure you want to poke that bear? Shaq's voice was steady. I don't poke. I break silence. Then, Derek sighed. I'll see what I can find. Shaq leaned back, his grip on the phone tightening. Appreciate it. He hung up. And now, he waited. It didn't take long. The next morning, Derek called back. His tone was grim. Shaq, you weren't kidding, he said. Mercer isn't just rich, he's protected. Political ties, offshore accounts, dirt on the right people. That man is a ghost when it comes to the law. Shaq frowned. And Cassie? Derek exhaled. She was innocent, completely. Mercer's company funneled millions through fake accounts and blamed her for it. She never saw a dime of it. Shaq's grip tightened. I pulled up some sealed records, Derek continued. There was an internal investigation at one point, but it never went anywhere. Documents got lost. Witnesses stopped talking. Shaq's teeth clenched. Because Mercer made sure of it. Derek sighed. Yeah. Shaq exhaled slowly. He had expected corruption, but hearing it, knowing it, made his blood boil. Cassie had been a pawn, a convenient scapegoat, and it had cost her everything. Shaq ended the call and sat in silence for a long time. Then he pulled up a new number, a number he hadn't used in years. He made the call. After a few rings, a smooth, authoritative voice answered. Shaq, it's been a while. Shaq didn't bother with small talk. How do I bring down Daniel Mercer? A low chuckle. That depends. How far are you willing to go? Shaq's jaw tightened. All the way. A pause. Then let's talk. The next few days moved fast. Shaq pulled strings, made calls, met with people behind closed doors. He reached out to old friends in high places, lawyers, investigators, people who owed him favors. Bit by bit, the real story came together. Cassie had been right. Mercer had been laundering money for years, using dummy corporations to cover his tracks. When the numbers started raising red flags, he needed someone to blame, someone small, expendable. Cassie had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Mercer had erased her like she was nothing. Shaq's blood boiled. He had seen a lot in his life, a lot of bad people doing bad things. But this was evil. And Shaq wasn't the kind of man to let evil win. He sat Cassie down later that evening, his office dimly lit, the weight of what he was about to say hanging between them. I know everything, he said. Cassie's breath hitched. Shaq's gaze was steady. I know Mercer framed you. I know you were innocent. And I know he's still looking for you. Cassie closed her eyes, her body going still. Shaq leaned forward. Cassie, listen to me. We can fix this. I have people working on it. We can clear your name. Cassie inhaled sharply. You don't understand. Shaq's jaw tightened. Then explain it to me. She shook her head. If you expose him, he'll come after you. He doesn't just make people disappear. He ruins them. Shaq's lips pressed into a thin line. Let him try. Cassie's eyes widened. Shaq exhaled. I don't scare easy. Her throat bobbed. Shaq, you think I'm gonna stand by and let this slide? His voice was low, firm, unshakable. That ain't how I was raised. Cassie's eyes filled with something raw. Shaq softened. You've been fighting alone for too long. Cassie swallowed hard. I don't know how to do anything else. Shaq exhaled, leaning back. Then it's time you learned. Cassie bit her lip, her hands trembling. Shaq watched her carefully. But there's a catch. She frowned. If we do this, Shaq said, Mercer will know. Cassie's face paled. Shaq didn't sugarcoat it. He'll come for you. He'll come for me. He'll fight dirty. Cassie's hands curled into fists. Shaq let that sink in before continuing. But he won't win. Cassie looked up. Shaq's eyes burned with absolute certainty. "You have me now," he said, "and I don't lose." Cassie's breath shuddered. She wanted to believe him. For the first time in years, she wanted to believe someone could actually help. But belief was dangerous. Hope was dangerous. Because what if Mercer was stronger? Shaq seemed to read her mind. He smirked. "You forget who you're dealing with?" Cassie exhaled a shaky laugh. Shaq leaned forward. "We take this to the right people. Expose him, clear your name. You walk free." Cassie hesitated. "And if it goes wrong?" Shaq didn't blink. "Then he learns what happens when he messes with the wrong people." Cassie swallowed. This was it. The moment. The decision. She had spent years hiding, years running, years believing she had no way out. And now? Now, Shaq was giving her one. All she had to do was take it. A long, tense silence. Then, she nodded. Shaq exhaled, relief washing over him. But deep down, he knew. This fight? It was only just beginning. Cassie had spent years preparing for the worst. She had learned to live in the shadows, to keep her head down, to survive with as little as possible. She had trained herself to expect disappointment, to never hope too much, to never let her guard down. Because every time she had thought things were getting better, they hadn't. Every time she thought she was safe, she wasn't. So when she walked into work that morning, she wasn't expecting anything to be different. She was just expecting another day. But what she got was the shock of her life. Cassie stepped into the grand kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee filling the air. The staff was already busy, voices blending into the hum of morning routine. It was the same as always, except for one thing. She stopped. Her breath caught in her throat, because on the center island waiting for her was something that didn't belong there. A key. A contract. And beside them, a neatly stacked pile of papers. She stared, her pulse thudding in her ears. Slowly she stepped forward, her hands unsteady as she reached for the papers. Her eyes scanned the words, her brain struggling to process what she was seeing. Her name. Her real name. Her charges. Dropped. Her record. Cleared. Cassie's hands began to tremble. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. But the official signatures, the stamped seals, the legal jargon confirming her innocence, they were all there. She lifted her gaze, her vision blurring. And standing in the doorway, arms crossed, was Shaq, watching her, waiting. Cassie opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Shaq gave a small nod toward the key. "That's yours." Cassie blinked, her breath shaky. "What? What is this?" Shaq stepped closer. "Your new place." Cassie felt her heart stop. Shaq leaned against the counter, his voice calm but firm. "I told you I had people working on it. You're free, Cassie. No more hiding, no more running. You can start over." Cassie's chest ached. She looked down at the key, the papers, the contract. Things she had convinced herself she would never have again. A home. A future. A name that belonged to her. Her fingers curled around the key, gripping it like it might disappear if she let go. She swallowed hard. I don't know what to say." Shaq gave a small smile. "You don't have to say anything." Cassie exhaled sharply, a single tear slipping down her cheek before she could stop it. Shaq saw, but he didn't say anything, didn't call attention to it, didn't make her feel small for breaking. He just stood there, solid and steady, like a man who never had any intention of letting her fall. Cassie looked up at him, her throat tight. Shaq held her gaze. Everybody deserves a second chance. Cassie let out a breath. Shaky. Unsteady. And for the first time in years, she believed him. Some stories aren't just told, they're felt. What would you do if someone you trusted was hiding the truth? If doing the right thing meant risking it all? The fight for justice doesn't end here. It's only the beginning. Stay ready, because the next chapter is always closer than you think.